We are here with Awaken and Manifest Your Best Life, the podcast experience. So I wanted to do something a little bit different this month. And for one, celebrate the fact that 11/11 is coming. This is actually my anniversary date around when I had my spiritual awakening and Kundalini awakening. I've been getting a lot of feedback around Kundalini. It's been a repeated occurrence that keeps coming up and coming up and coming up. And I usually listen to these things when they appear because it shows me that there is a reason and a purpose that we need to talk about it. So what I wanted to really do over this next month is give you Kundalini 101, a series and almost a free course on Kundalini so you can walk away and understand how to really grasp Kundalini awakening. A long time ago, I released a blog on, a series of on my blog about Kundalini and essentially how you can start to understand the entire process, the beginning steps of how to get started. And people love that series. To this day, I still get feedback about that series. And it is one of my top performing pages, even on Google. And so what I would like to do is kind of give you an updated version of that and understand how to show you more of an in-depth analysis, kind of a more personal behind the scenes look of Kundalini, how to understand it so that you're not frantically looking on Google and hunting down on Reddit forums and trying to figure it out. And I thought this is a beautiful way to kind of merge what I currently do in my life and also kind of give you an in-depth behind the scenes view of Kundalini. So if you'll join me for Kundalini 101. So this series is going to be for anyone who is new to awakening or a spiritual awakening, who wants to know more in depth about the process, how to understand themselves. Because if I were to just get real and honest with you, that is something that I really wish I had when I was going through a spiritual awakening on 11/11/11. Back in 2011, there was a moment where I just was like, man, I really wish I had a book or a guide or something to help me. And as you know, I am writing a book and I am in the process of writing a book. And I thought one way to kind of get me excited and get you excited about the book is to do this series. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to really explore Kundalini and spiritual awakening in a way that I don't really see a lot of people talking about. If you were to just go on Amazon or if you even go on Google, there isn't a lot out there on Kundalini. There really isn't, unless you start looking into ancient texts and all this ancient, very outdated work. We are not really seeing a lot of information on Kundalini anywhere. And I think it's fascinating because it's a very real phenomena that is happening, that is more and more people are experiencing. And this phenomena that we're experiencing, people are waking up now and they are lost and confused and they don't know what's going on. And there's not a lot of reference material to even turn to anymore. And I think it's very fascinating how we can really be a deeper look into this deeper conversation that's happening around expanding consciousness as a whole. And rather than relying on channelings and all of these kind of frou-frou new age terms, and to instead break it down so it's practical, so it's real, so you walk away with some solid understanding and most of all understand how to get started. First thing I really want to talk about is understanding the dark night of the soul. What is the dark night of the soul? The dark night of the soul is the process where you are literally going through what is known as an ego death experience or a loss of identity. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to understanding the dark night of the soul, the hugest thing you have to realize without a doubt is understanding that when you grew up, you had conditioning. And that conditioning became how you became to be a human and how you learned how to do certain things in life, how you understood certain behaviors, how you understood your beliefs about money, how you understood how to have a relationship in life. All of these things literally taught you how to grow up and became your conditioning. that conditioning became your personal identity of who you are. And this is what is known as your paradigm. Your paradigm is the way that you are thinking, feeling, acting, behaving, and resonating in life. When you have a spiritual awakening or Kundalini awakening, what is occurring is your paradigm is shifting. Your entire worldview is shifting because your consciousness itself is changing from a place of unconscious awareness to conscious awareness. This is the number one thing you have to realize with a dark night of the soul is why do you have a dark night of the soul? Because you are losing grips with your old paradigm, the old identity of who you are, your past self. So that past self is now coming up to almost like gripping on and holding on to reality, and the new self that is having a spiritual awakening or Kundalini awakening is starting to appear and starting to be born and starting to be rebirthed, essentially. And so it's kind of like if you were to just envision that there's different levels of how you perceive reality. There's different ways of looking at the world. For example, a person who grew up rich from the get-go has a way different mindset from a person who's in absolute poverty consciousness and has certain beliefs and certain behaviors. Those two paradigms are wildly different, and they behave differently, they act differently, and they show up differently. Now, if you were to just think about that in terms of how your past self is different than the evolved consciousness of your spiritual awakened self. So when you experience a dark night of the soul, your past self is essentially losing its bearings over your consciousness, and you're starting to come into a point of cognitive dissonance with those two realities. So you have two realities essentially fighting for each other, and one wants to win and one wants to lose. And it's like they are like duking it out on who wants to win. And what happens is it's almost like you have a tug of war in your consciousness. And this is what produces the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is the moment where you start to literally lose yourself. You are losing your sense of self, your sense of ID. In psychology, it's your ID. Not necessarily even your ego, it's your unconscious self. Your unconscious self is starting to become conscious. And this part of you that was fully unconscious to awareness, to consciousness itself, to understanding points of reality that are deeper than just the physical world, you start to come to terms with the spiritual self, the energetic world, different planes of consciousness, different dimensions of consciousness, different perceptions of reality in the world. So before you were living in an unconscious paradigm, and now you're in a conscious paradigm. And this conscious paradigm is wildly different than the unconscious paradigm. The unconscious paradigm, everything that was going on with your ego was just normal. It was just drama. It was just what was going on. But when you become conscious of your negativity and you become conscious of these things, you suddenly are almost at a gripping point where you want to change that part of you because you're just like, it doesn't feel good anymore. It doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel like it's a part of me. It feels almost wrong, or it feels like as if like there's something wrong. And this element of where you have to see that the dark night is basically the death of the old self is what I'm getting at. So the dark night of the soul is the death of the old consciousness. Now, what occurs at the death of the old consciousness is we experience something that's really called an identity crisis. Why do we have the identity crisis? Well, we have the identity crisis because we're essentially losing grips with the past self. So what occurs is your mind starts going to a point of, well, my old friends are no longer resonating with me. These old habits that I used to have are no longer resonating with me. I used to be really materialistic and love shopping and love doing all these things. And then all of a sudden, I just don't like that anymore. It's like you are growing up, but in consciousness, and not just being a teenager growing up into an adult. You're growing up in terms of how you are seeing yourself. And The other things that happen usually in the dark night of the soul is it's often a period of loss. So we'll experience something in our life that triggers loss. So this can be anything. And what you'll find is that the ego is essentially losing its grip over the past self. So all of the things that were connected to your past identity of self will start to fall away. And what you'll find is old friendships, old relationships, things that no longer serve you, things that were highly misaligned or toxic suddenly start to fall away, or they are brought to your attention to deal with. And all of these things start to rise up and come up as if you literally just pulled the rug off of you and all the crap is right there. And what happens is you have to deal with all of this old stuff out of nowhere because you're suddenly conscious of it. So here's the thing. It was there, but you weren't seeing it. So it's like you were aware of it before, but you weren't consciously aware of it before. Do you get what I mean? So it's like you knew it existed, but you didn't know that it was happening. So it's like you were on the hamster wheel, but then you didn't realize that you could just jump off the hamster wheel. And because of that concept, it's like your brain knows that it was like something was wrong, but you just felt off or funky, but you just said it was drama. You just said it's just how men are. It's just this particular relationship, and it's just this is how all people behave, and it was your beliefs. So your beliefs told you to think a certain way, and then all of a sudden you have this dark night of the soul that is questioning the core roots of your reality and how you're supposed to think and how you're supposed to feel, and it just kind of creates almost this moment where you feel a little bit insane because you're like, I used to feel this way, but I want to feel this way now. And what occurs is this period of identity crisis where you do not know which way is the right way anymore because the old self wants to stay the same and refuses to change. And then the new self is saying, but we need to change. And the spiritual awakening and the Kundalini is essentially kind of cleaning all these cobwebs up that were just there, but you weren't consciously aware of them. Now, what happens with the dark night of the soul is, to just summarize this up really quick, is to look at that you are essentially changing from the inside out, and the past self of you is starting to actually shift and change into the new, evolved, raising, higher vibrational, aligned self, the authentic self of who you are. Now, the dark night is the moment where you have to come to terms with that. And essentially, you learn that the death of the old self is necessary. Now, that's really what the dark night of the soul is. It's a moment where you are coming to terms with your past self, and you're making peace with that past self, and then you're transitioning into the new self. So the dark night is really a period of loss. It's a period of darkness. It's a period of pain or suffering or a lot of drama or negativity, or horrible things can even happen. It's a period where it's meant to be a period of death, a symbolic death of the old self. And so if you're in a symbolic death of the old self, your ego is going through a period of ego death, of consciousness, which means that the old ways of doing things, the old ways of thinking, the old ways of being can no longer exist. And so that is why it feels so uncomfortable, and that is why it can often feel almost traumatic, or like you feel yourself being like crazy. And it's like over the years, I've gotten a lot of comments where it's like, well, what about that part where you like go insane? No one ever talks about that. That's what's occurring with the identity crisis. So exactly what we're doing in the membership this month is we're talking about how you can start to use the identity shift to your personal advantage. Because here's the thing, when you start to identify that part of the journey is becoming conscious of consciousness itself, you can start to see that the dark night of the soul is about making peace with the past self so you can step into the new self. And that's really what it's about. And if you were to just even break it down even more simple than that, the dark night shows you this moment where this is the reason why you're losing friendships. This is the reason why you're suddenly, you lost your jobs. This is the reason suddenly that, something like a particular loss happened in your life, loss of a job, loss of a person, loss of a house. It can be any kind of loss. And this is what's occurring is it's the death of the old you. Okay, so if you deeply enjoyed this episode, I have more where that came from with our Spiritual Awakening Roadmap series. You can get that at roadmap.theawakenedstate.net. And I'll see you guys next time for the next video. If you want to tune into the new series, you need to watch this next video.